This video is sponsored by me and you. Find out more at the end. It is often said that the stories of the prophets of Islam are full of wisdom and teaching moments, and I'd like to challenge some of those claims by bringing the stories to life using visual aids and a contemporary tone. If you think that might offend you, this is your chance to pause and watch something else. I've already told a couple of tales about Prophet Muhammad and one about Prophet Musa, aka Moses. Today's story is also about Musa. And I'm going to do two very bold things. The first is that I'll use the climax of the story as the hook. Musa witnessed and condoned the murder of an innocent kid. But you're going to watch the video anyway, because here's my second bold move. I assert that the justification for the murder undermines the very foundation of the entire religion. In other words, this might make you question Islam altogether. Using my prophetic powers, I can already foresee some comments saying, Alhamdulillah, this has only made my faith stronger. But if you think deeply about the conundrum this story presents without pride and pretense, it becomes very hard to keep your faith, let alone strengthen it. But don't you worry about all that now. That's a problem for future you. The main plot of the story is from the Quran, verses 60 to 82 of Surah Al-Kahf. Yet a lot of the details are from the Hadith, and as always, sources are listed in the description. As the story goes, Musa was giving a sermon when he was asked who's the most knowledgeable man among the people, to which he replied, I am. But in another version of the story, Musa volunteered that information unprompted, saying that he's not aware of someone on earth more knowledgeable than him. Either way, Allah didn't like it. He admonished Musa for not giving him credit for this knowledge, and informed him that there is indeed a more knowledgeable man. Musa wanted to know how to find that man, and Allah said that he's at the junction of the two seas. That's pretty vague, so Musa asked for directions, and Allah instructed him to take a fish in a basket. Where he loses the fish, he'll find the man. Can't get more specific than that, I guess. They didn't have Google Maps yet. So Musa did as he was instructed. He brought a fish, put it in a basket, and embarked on a journey with his servant boy. They walked and walked till they reached a rock by the beach, where Musa had a little nap. In the meantime, the fish miraculously made its way out of the basket and into the sea. But Musa didn't notice the fish's departure. So when he woke up, they continued walking, and walking, and walking, till Musa told his servant that they're tired, and ordered him to give them their lunch. And that's when the servant remembered how the fish miraculously made its way into the sea. How the heck do you forget something like that, you might ask? Well, of course, the story has a clever explanation. The servant said that the only reason he forgot to inform Musa is because the shaitan made him forget. How convenient. Musa says that's what we've been waiting for. So they followed their footsteps back to the rock where they found a man sleeping with his clothes on his face. Musa figured it's probably the wise guy, so he uncovered the man and said salam. Al-Khidr asked, Who are you? Musa identified himself and said that he's there to learn. In response, Al-Khidr was very dismissive and predicted that Musa wouldn't be patient enough. But Musa was persistent, so Al-Khidr agreed to let him tag along as long as he didn't ask any questions. That's a bold teaching strategy. Let's see if it pays off for him. As they're walking by the shore, they were approached by some local fishermen on a boat. Turns out they know Al-Khidr, so they offered him a free ride. How nice of them. You love to see it. So there they are, riding their little boat, when a bird lands on the edge and dips its beak into the water. Al-Khidr poetically says, My knowledge and your knowledge have not decreased Allah's knowledge except as much as the bird has decreased the water of the sea with its beak. Which is a bizarre analogy because knowledge isn't decreased when it's shared. It may even get a chance to multiply and lead to more knowledge, but that's besides the point. As Musa was digesting that nugget of wisdom, he noticed Al-Khidr damaging the boat with an adze. He protested and exclaimed, asking why he damaged the boat and if he's trying to sink its owners. Al-Khidr gloated about how he foresaw Musa's impatience, causing Musa to apologize and blame his forgetfulness. Crisis averted, I guess. So they kept going on their merry way till they found a bunch of kids playing together. Though I'm not going to show it on screen. What happened next is a bit graphic, so be warned. Al-Khidr made a beeline to one of the children and murdered him. According to one narrator, he plucked the boy's head from his body like an apple. According to another narrator, he pushed the kid over and beheaded him with a knife. Musa was horrified to see his partner in crime, his brother in faith, commit such a heinous act. He exclaimed, Have you killed an innocent soul who killed no one? You've done a horrible thing. But Al-Khidr gives fewer Fs than a 10-year professor. He just repeats what he said earlier. Didn't I tell you that you won't be patient? Musa was bested yet again and submissively asked for one last chance. If he asks another question, Al-Khidr can kick him off this learning expedition / escalating crime spree. So they kept walking till they reached a town, and they were hungry. But they didn't have any food on them. You'd think the wisest man on earth would plan ahead and pack a lunchbox for when he's on the lam, but the story doesn't mention the presence of a woman in his life, so that makes sense. They approached the residence asking for food, but were unfortunately denied any hospitality. So they continued walking, till Al-Khidr noticed a wall that's in bad shape and about to fall. So he fixed it by wiping his hand on it. I don't know if you guys picked up on this yet, but I think this guy might be a wizard. Musa was hangry, so he commented on how Al-Khidr could have gotten paid for that work. Al-Khidr had enough, and he said, "This is where we part ways. Now I can tell you what you weren't patient enough to learn." The justification for damaging the boat is that it belonged to some poor fishermen who depended on it for their livelihood, and there was a tyrant king who forcibly took every boat, so Al-Khidr wanted to make it flawed to avoid its confiscation. The justification for killing the kid is that his parents were believers and Al-Khidr feared that the kid would grow up to tire them with his disobedience and disbelief, so Allah wanted to replace him with someone more virtuous and caring. The justification for fixing the wall is pretty uninteresting if I'm being honest. The wall belonged to a pair of orphans, and under it was a treasure left for them by their virtuous father, so Al-Khidr wanted to make sure that it stayed hidden till they found it. And that wraps up all that Musa couldn't be patient about. Of course, I have a lot to say about this story, but before I start picking it apart, remember to poke that like button to give the YouTube algorithm a bit of encouragement. There's more to this story than the murder of an innocent child, so I'll start my commentary by pointing out the inconsistencies in both the sources and the plot, and I'll interlace the critique of the plot in between. As I mentioned earlier, in one version of the story, Musa voluntarily said he's not aware of someone on earth more knowledgeable than him, and I understand why Allah would want to admonish him for this potential arrogance. But in another narration, he was asked who the most knowledgeable man is, and answered, "I am." In both versions, he didn't overstep into Allah's domain and say, "I know more than Allah," just that, as far as he knew, he had more knowledge than other humans. Still, Allah gets jealous when he's not talked about 24/7, so yeah, preferably he would have said, "I know the most thanks to Allah," or something of the sort. But in yet another narration, neither of those events take place. It was during a conversation with God that Musa asked how he could better himself, and whether there's a more knowledgeable man he could learn from. These are three very different beginnings to the story. One is somewhat arrogant, the other is less arrogant, and the third is completely humble. These contradictions are not deemed by Muslim scholars to be consequential or major, of course, but I think they're noteworthy. Here's another inconsistency. According to one hadith, Musa didn't stop to nap at the rock. He just continued walking and left the servant behind, and that's when the fish escaped. Speaking of the fish, I might as well call it Schrodinger's fish because it's not quite clear whether it's dead or alive. Most narrations indicate that the fish was salted or cooked and put in a basket, but the English translation of Ibn Kathir's book, Stories of the Prophets, mentions a live fish in water-filled vessel. I'm not sure where they got that detail from, to be honest. Either way, one source attributes the dead fish's reanimation to the magic powers of a spring in the rock that gives life. Sounds like recycled mythology to me, but I suppose anything is possible in an era gushing with divine intervention. Anyway, it doesn't really matter whether it was God who reanimated it directly, or if an enchanted youth spring brought it to life, or if the fish simply didn't want to die in that basket. I find it funny how the water apparently arched over the fish when it jumped into the water, almost like Musa and everything he touched became hydrophobic. Kudos for keeping it consistent with the splitting of the sea narrative, I suppose. Moving on, when Musa asked the servant for their meal, does that mean that he gave up on finding Al-Khidr? Because Allah is using the fish as a navigational tool, so if Musa ate it, how does he think they'll find the man afterwards? It's like using the last 3% of your phone battery to order delivery instead of following the map home. And this one's not really a criticism, but an open-ended question. Why does Allah like to play games? I mean, why use a fish as a compass? It's not like Musa needed to see a miracle to believe in God and his powers. Maybe the miracle is supposed to impress people who weren't there, but to a non-believer, it's just a mythological story. It doesn't prove that there's a God who can animate dead fish. Alas, God works in mysterious ways. Or is that fish yet another plot point meant to vilify the devil? Because the servant says that the only thing that made him forget to tell Musa about the miracle is shaitan. But how does the servant know that? Does he have a supernatural ability to see the devil? Does he have ilm al-ghaib, meaning, how do you pronounce that word? Prescience. Does the servant have prescience? And it's not like this is posed as a plausible theory to explain why he forgot. Perhaps shaitan made me forget. It's said with certainty, and it is quoted in the Quran, meaning these are Allah's words about the servant's accusation against the devil. And the Quran was written before the creation of humanity and the devil. Let's try to wrap our heads around that. Before creating the servant or the devil, before creating space and time, Allah said that the servant said that the devil made him forget. Are you with me so far? So shaitan was set up to fail because there was nothing he could have done to invalidate that verse and clear his name. So I ask you, dear viewer, how can anyone in this story have free will? Hold on to this question because we'll run into it again. It foreshadows the biggest flaw in Islam. Moving on with the story, when Musa found the wise man Al-Khidr, he identified himself as Musa. And according to one source, Al-Khidr immediately knew who that was. But according to another source, he asked, Musa who? And when they saw a bird dipping its beak in the water, one source says that it happened on the boat, while another says that it happened on the beach. Granted, these are minor inconsistencies, but here's a bigger one. In the Quranic verse, Musa asks if he can follow Al-Khidr, while in the hadiths, he states that he came to learn. There's a big difference between asking for permission and stating that God sent you. I often hear Muslims say that they dismiss any hadiths that disagree with the Quran, but they can't and won't dismiss a hadith like this one. Because without these hadiths, the Quran makes very little sense. If you pick up the Quran and read the story, it starts with, "And remember when Moses said to his young assistant, I will never give up until I reach the junction of the two seas, even if I travel for ages." From the Quran alone, nobody knows what the author is talking about. And the next verse, "But when they reached the point where the seas met, they forgot their fish, and it made its way into the sea, slipping away wondrously." There's a fish now? What fish? What are you talking about? I take it for granted that any half-decent book won't introduce characters to a story without exposition, but the Quran throws them around willy-nilly. Anyway, going back to the wise man and his felonies. First, he damages the boat, so the tyrant king won't confiscate it. Because apparently the king is a perfectionist who doesn't steal slightly damaged boats, I guess. Sure, whatever. But why didn't Al-Khidr explain to the fishermen why he did it? Because from their point of view, he's an asshole. You give a guy a free ride and he puts a hole in your boat. No good deed goes unpunished. Perhaps if he told the fishermen about this trick, they'll tell other fishermen, and soon enough the king won't find any flawless boats to steal. Or perhaps the king would lower his standards and start stealing all boats, damaged or not, which would be counterintuitive. But why is Al-Khidr dealing with the symptom rather than the cause of the problem? I can't help but notice the parallels between this solution, making the victim less appealing, and the Islamic solution for sexual assault, making women less appealing. Surely the most knowledgeable man on earth could devise a way to deal with the predatory king rather than deter him from stealing one boat by harming its owners. If Al-Khidr's power of intervention was limited to minor acts and minor changes to the timeline, then I'd give him a pass for strategic vandalism. However, he clearly has the power and divine authority to murder a child, which would drastically affect the child, of course, and his parents, and anyone else he could have interacted with. As for his motive for murder, buckle up because I'm about to destroy this religion at its foundation. It's explained in this one verse. "And as for the boy, his parents were believers, and we feared that he would overburden them by transgression and disbelief." Let's start with the wording of that. فَخَشِينَا. So we feared. Who's we? Is it referring to Allah and Al-Khidr? So was it a decision that they made together? Well, scholars say it might have been Al-Khidr's way of referring to himself alone as plural, and that Allah gave him the authority to do ijtihad when it comes to murder, to use his reasoning to assess whether it's beneficial to kill someone. Using that interpretation, Al-Khidr used his divinely given knowledge of the future that the kid will grow up to be a disbeliever, and feared that outcome, so he killed to prevent it. Yet, some scholars say that the we refers to both Allah and Al-Khidr, and some say that the root word khishya doesn't literally mean fear in this context, but means hate or dislike. So Allah and Al-Khidr disliked that future outcome. And some say that the word means no. So Allah says, that Al-Khidr says, we knew He will overburden them. But here's the kicker. One variant of the Quran, yes, there are different variants of the Quran. One variant of the Quran reads, فَخَافَ رَبُّكَ, so your God feared. Khawf is a different root word than khishya, but it also means fear. So why does an omniscient God fear anything? Or if Allah meant dislike, but somehow used two different words that meant fear instead of using the clear word فَكَرِهْنَا or فَكَرِهَ رَبُّكَ, why does Allah hate or dislike something that He saw coming? Why does Allah hate or dislike something that He destined to happen? Again, let's try to wrap our heads around the Islamic narrative. Before creating space and time and humanity, Allah wrote the Quran, where He says that Al-Khidr and Allah feared that a child will grow up to become a kafir. Then He proceeded to create the entire universe and sit His ass on His throne for a few billion years, waiting for the planets to form and evolution to run its course, then waiting for Al-Khidr to be born, then waiting for a child to be born, only to inspire Al-Khidr to murder that child publicly to avoid his future. Does that make sense to you? Religious preachers will give you this spiel and tell you that your mind is too deficient to comprehend it. I'm sorry if that part was all over the place, but it's not my fault the Islamic narrative is so laughably messy. Regardless of how you interpret this verse, every interpretation poses a faith-shattering problem. If it's not already clear how predestination undermines free will, let me spell it out for you. There are several hadiths where Muhammad explicitly says that the child was created to be a disbeliever. طُبِعَ كَافِرًا, destined to be a disbeliever. And Muslim scholars would jump on the opportunity to tell you how merciful the murder was, because children go to heaven, so killing him effectively saved him from hell. But that's a dangerous game to play, because using that logic, a religious extremist can easily rationalize murdering children of disbeliever enemies to guarantee that they go to heaven. Extremism aside, let's concede that it's nice of Al-Khidr to save the kid from hell. But Allah creates billions of children who are destined to grow up to be disbelievers, yet doesn't intervene to change their fate before they die as kuffar. If Allah wants to live up to His name Al-Adl, the utterly just, then He wouldn't intervene in one specific instance and destine the rest to eternal hell. This right here should make you question Islam altogether, because it's not consistent or coherent. Allah can't even simultaneously live up to His 99 contradictory names. How can He be both selectively merciful and ultimately just? And it doesn't seem like this murder was done altruistically to minimize the child's suffering, because Al-Khidr or Allah could have killed him in a less brutal fashion, in a less public setting. He could have died peacefully in his sleep instead of being mutilated while out playing with other children. Or for that matter, Allah could have avoided creating him to begin with. Or Al-Khidr could have wiped the kid's forehead and killed him using magic, the same way that he fixed the wall. But this story isn't about peace and well-being. This is about how the ends justify the means. This is about vilifying disbelievers and compensating the believing parents. And that's made very clear by the verse. So we hope that their Lord would give them another, more virtuous and caring in His place. The parents will be fine. They'll get a replacement under warranty. Here's a source that claims the boy was replaced with a daughter, who then married a prophet and gave birth to 70 prophets. In other words, don't worry about the worthless dead kafir kid. Allah replaced him with 70 invaluable, pious believers. Some other narrations cited in the exegesis in the Tafsir say that the boy was replaced with a slave. It's very transactional. There's no value to the kafir kid's life except as a placeholder for something better. There's no elaboration on why he was devalued by being destined for disbelief. Instead, here's the repetitive trash-talking and archetyping of a kafir. The story clearly links the child's future disbelief to being a bad person who will cause his parents suffering, as if to say that disbelievers are nothing but trouble. It should be very concerning to you that in my hundreds of hours of videos and live streams, I have made fewer bigoted and vilifying statements than the author of the perfect Quran. I never said, "Have you heard of a Muslim? That is the one who is cruel to orphans," or "Those are the worst of people," or "Muslims will not be pleased with you till you obey them," because these are irresponsible generalizations. So I ask, as I did in my last video, am I better than Allah? But wait, there's more. There seems to be an acknowledgement that the child's parents, who are good believers, could either be coerced into disbelief or swayed into it out of love for their son. So there's an acknowledgement that belief isn't a free choice, and good people can end up in hell due to circumstance. That undermines the fairness and the so-called test of life and Allah's criteria for judgment. If he recognizes external influences in this one example and intervenes, then why can't Allah recognize that most people believe or disbelieve because of circumstance? He seems to be very inconsistent. Just like Al-Khidr is inconsistent with assessing risk, since he has a license to kill those who may negatively influence believers in the future, why didn't he kill the thief king who's actively ruining people's lives? He doesn't need to fear or predict that outcome. He can see it happening in real life. But he stands up to the king by damaging someone else's boat and helps the parents by murdering their child. Here's another open-ended question. If that child was going to have children of his own in the future, what happens to all the souls from that lineage now that they've been erased? Do they get allocated to different bodies? Or do they go to heaven directly? Or cease to exist? Or did they never exist to begin with because that was Allah's plan all along? If I was alive when Muhammad told these stories, I would have been the biggest thorn in his side, and Umar would have probably beheaded me for it. Now, I don't think I'm special at all. I'm sure there were many people who had the same questions as I did, but they were drowned in a sea of religious arrogance and persecution. But mark my words, the tides are changing. Regarding the last plot point, Al-Khidr fixing the wall, my only criticism is that technically Musa never asked the third question. The rule was, don't ask me about anything till I mention it, and Musa didn't ask. He said, you could have gotten paid for this. That's a statement. Not, why didn't you get paid for this? So technically he still had a third strike to spare. A good question would have been, why don't you use your magic powers to feed us? But that's just me being nitpicky. I don't think Musa was going to learn anything by shadowing Al-Khidr for any longer anyway. The last array of criticisms I have is about Al-Khidr and Allah's teaching methods. According to all sources, Quran and Hadith, Al-Khidr was basically betting against Musa from the very beginning. All he smugly said was, you won't and can't be patient. Musa asks why he vandalized the boat. Didn't I tell you won't be patient? Musa asks why he killed a child. Didn't I tell you won't be patient? What is Musa supposed to learn from quietly watching a man commit crimes with no rhyme or reason? And if Al-Khidr is the most knowledgeable man on earth, then I assume that nobody alive at the time possessed the knowledge required to be an effective educator, because a good teacher may foresee a student's failure, but he doesn't smugly repeat that prediction. A good teacher adapts his approach to the student in order to avoid their failure. And I use the word failure very loosely here, because at worst, Musa failed to contain his curiosity for an explanation of what he's supposed to learn. Curiosity should be rewarded, not punished. But more realistically, perhaps he wasn't thinking about the learning process at all, and he just wanted to know why the hell he's an accessory to murder. An apologist could say that the moral of the story, or the lesson that Musa is being taught, is to always seek knowledge because you don't have as much of it as you think. And that much I agree with. But the way that Al-Khidr and Allah flaunt their knowledge is not meant to humble you into research and learning. It's meant to humble you into submission. Just shut up and repeat what you're told, because Allah and His people, the people that He chose, will always know more than you. I mean, Musa specifically went on this journey to learn, but he was dismissed and berated the entire time. If the second most knowledgeable man on earth was so utterly lost compared to another human, and both are so lost compared to Allah, what a believer might surmise from this tale is that they know nothing, and will always know nothing. So they should blindly trust Allah and His spokespeople. This isn't an unfair and inflammatory accusation that I'm leveling against Islam. This is actually what many Muslim scholars conclude. Here's one example. The sincere disciple submits to his sheikh regardless of what he witnesses from him, and he follows the sheikh's orders in everything, whether or not he understands the wisdom from the sacred law in that. Pause the video and read the rest of it. It's very problematic. In an environment that encourages submissiveness and blind obedience, and discourages critical thinking outside the bounds of what Islam allows you to think about, abuse will undoubtedly thrive. Yet believers continue to defend the religion and scapegoat humans for misusing it, despite the religion methodically molding its followers into subservience and vulnerability. This is why it's important to pick apart such parables. I used to be one of those believers who trusted religion more than their own senses, and such stories didn't make me more receptive to seeking knowledge. They made me more receptive to religion's claims from authority. Going back to the story, what was the lesson supposed to be if Musa was indeed patient? Sorry, patient isn't the right word. If Musa submissively muted his inquisitiveness and objections to murder, what value would waiting even longer have added to the learning experience? Al-Khidr was not teaching Musa a methodology. He didn't instruct him on how to pick up clues and do background research and consider all the factors before taking action. He didn't teach Musa anything about how to handle a similar situation in the future. And had Musa continued shadowing him, he still wouldn't have gained the circumstantial knowledge that Allah seemingly beamed into the wise man's head. So the best way for Musa to learn is by being given the same knowledge base as Al-Khidr, including some ilm al-ghaib, and then learning from Al-Khidr how to turn that knowledge into useful action. But the way they were operating, I just don't see how that could be useful. But Prophet Muhammad disagrees with me, because he said in multiple hadiths, "May Allah have mercy on Musa. Had he been patient, he would have seen amazing things." I mean, maybe he would have seen more outrageous crimes, but I doubt he would have learned anything from them. And it seemed like Muhammad himself doesn't understand predestination, because Musa could not have acted any differently if the Quran was written before his creation. If Musa was any more patient, so to speak, then those verses wouldn't make sense anymore, and Allah would have to amend the Quran. I would have really loved to have Muhammad on one of my Why Do You Believe live streams, because I want to know what the heck is going on in his mind. Because if Islam is indeed the truth, I assure you I would have done more to clarify that in one conversation with Muhammad than all the da'wah lectures combined. See, that was me being a bit arrogant. Now I'll just wait for Allah's admonishment. I'll be walking around with a fish in my bag for the foreseeable future. Jokes aside, I think I have a point here. If Islam is perfect and Allah is perfect, He wouldn't see me as an enemy, but an ally. He'd want critics to try to poke holes and demonstrate how airtight Islam is. He would appreciate constructive criticism. But since there is no room for improvement in perfection, I can only conclude that the presence of room for improvement implies imperfection. And this story could use a lot of improvement. If it was intended as a parable, then I think I've sufficiently pointed out the gaps in the moral lessons that it's supposed to teach. And if it's a literal story that actually happened, then the author is insulting our intelligence by writing a story with such little detail and so many plot holes. Here's a few more. When Al-Khidr damaged the boat, how did the owners react? I presume that must have been a small boat, so they would have noticed. Did they awkwardly stand there for the rest of the ride as Al-Khidr told Musa to shut up about it? And how does Al-Khidr have a good relationship with people in his community if he harms them with no explanation? Then when they killed the kid, how did the crowd react? There must have been some witnesses, since the hadith says that there were children playing. Are the other kids traumatized by watching their friend get beheaded out of the blue? Was that trauma unavoidable? And was it worth it? Or does the end justify the means? And how did they continue on their journey after committing murder in broad daylight without being hunted down? How is Al-Khidr supposed to show his face again in these places? Or is he always on the move because he burns bridges wherever he goes? But that can't be true, since he already had a pre-existing relationship with the fishermen. And how did the servant make it home? Or was he also an accessory to the crime spree? A perfect book doesn't have lazy writing and more plot holes than a Marvel movie. This isn't perfection. Obviously, I don't believe any of this actually happened. I'm not saying that Islam is false because Allah condoned child murder. I'm invalidating Islam's claims to perfection and demonstrating how it contradicts itself. To quote a verse, "Do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction." Challenge accepted, I guess. All that being said, is there anything we can learn from this story? Yes, but it's not that you should submissively bow down to your mentors, nor that you should feel inferior to someone because they brandish their knowledge for authority. The most obvious lesson is that things may not always be as they seem, and that the butterfly effect is formidable. Every decision you make can ripple into unintended, far-reaching consequences, so make sure to weigh your options carefully. The story also teaches us about the unbridled power and importance of narrative. Facts matter, but not as much as the story. It's how asking questions is no longer a humble and noble pursuit of knowledge, but an act of arrogance, disobedience, and impatience, all because of a fictional backstory. It's how killing can be spun into a positive thing. It's not the loss of an innocent life, it's the saving of two innocent believers, and saving the victim too, all because of a fictional backstory. The power of narrative is why religion has such a hold on humanity, and unless the irreligious and secular can turn facts into narrative, religion will always have the upper hand. Can you think of an irreligious narrative that can unite humanity? And what do you think of my commentary on the story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And before I end the video, here's some miscellaneous commentary that I couldn't fit in earlier. More than one hadith mentions this little tidbit. One of the narrators, called Nauf al-Bakali, claims that Moses from this story is not the Prophet Moses, to which Ibn Abbas says, "Kadhiba aduwullah," the enemy of Allah has lied. Not that Nauf is mistaken, but he's an enemy of God and intentionally telling a lie. That's a pretty serious accusation to throw around in a society that doesn't take kindly to enemies of Allah. Now, scholars say that it's merely a passionate exaggeration, and Ibn Abbas isn't actually accusing him of being kafir. It's just how Arabs at the time spoke. So when you're reading hadiths, which inform the context and explanation of the Quran, remember that they were narrated by men who exaggerate and name-call. That's who's filling in the blanks in the Quran. Speaking of the Quran, it's extremely disjointed. Like I said, the story begins abruptly with no context, and after the last relevant verse, the next one is about Dhul Qarnayn. I've already made a video about this one, and it's supposed to answer one of the 3 questions Muhammad was asked to prove his prophethood. I urge you to read this chapter from start to finish so you can understand how disordered and fragmented the Quran actually is. It lacks context and organization, which is the bare minimum you'd expect from a good guidebook. The context is provided by hot-headed men who are prone to exaggeration. Here's what one scholar thinks is the lesson to be learned from killing the child. One can extrapolate that it is necessary to kill one's unlawful desires, as well as the demonic and selfish influences that exist within him. That's one hell of an extrapolation. What demons? It was a child playing. Read the whole quote because it's so out of touch with reality. How he got that for murdering a kid? I have no idea. Again, highlighting the power of narrative. This next one's hilarious. The majority of scholars think that Al-Khidr is still alive today, like Ya'juj and Ma'juj, because he took a bath in a magical spring of life. That's just stolen from Greek mythology, just straight up. So Al-Khidr is alive, and he hangs out with Prophet Ilyas every Eid. But then the scholars argue among each other, if he's alive, did he attend Muhammad's funeral? Well, they can't seem to agree. Some say that he can't be alive because of the hadith where Muhammad said that the day of judgment will happen before a young boy is dead. We're still here, so the apologists interpret it as nobody on earth will be alive by the time this young boy is dead. But Al-Khidr could be an exception, I guess? Anyway, this is why this video took me so long to make. Every little tidbit is a detour towards madness. And lastly, I think I know what really happened to that fish. This is the truth they don't want you to know. Wake up, sheeple. And this wraps up all I have to say about this story. Again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And I'd like to thank all my members and patrons for giving me the resources I need to make these videos. If you'd like to support what I do, links are in the description. And if you'd like to support the artist Jasmine by requesting a commission, her contact information is also in the description. Thank you all for watching. And as always, think critically and think for yourself.